There were two options for lessons last week. I chose David and Goliath because I wanted to see what Brad would do with it. But I could have chosen the story of David becoming a member of Saul's court. Because Saul was ill and mentally troubled, David's playing of the lyre was the only thing that could soothe Saul, and so Saul made him a member of the court. And David, being in the court, became very close friends with Jonathan. They considered themselves brothers. Now, much happens between those stories and what happens today. Saul begins to dislike David intensely. He becomes jealous and suspicious. His emotion toward David borders on hatred, and in one place it's called murderous rage. There are numerous stories about Saul trying to kill David. There are also stories about David having an opportunity to kill Saul, but David chooses not to do that because he recognizes Saul as the God's anointed person, and you just don't mess with God's anointed. Finally, at the end of 1 Samuel, Saul and Jonathan die in a battle with the Philistines on Mount Gilboa. So this week's lesson is David's lament over Saul and Jonathan. It was recognized clear back then as a very specific type of poetry. It had its own meter, it had its own tone, there was a standard format, and the tone is somber but dignified. Now, a funeral lament was different than the laments we've heard and talked about in the Psalms. In the Psalms, the person speaking names their distress, talks about how terrible it is, and then says basically, Lord, get busy, do something. And by the end of the psalm, you're saying, thank you, God, for handling this problem, right? In today's passage, you'll notice there's no mention of God. There is no mention of asking God to get involved. There's no prayer. There's nothing religious, because funerals in ancient Israel were not a religious occasion. In ancient Israel, death was considered the end. Capital T, capital E, period. The end. It was the boundary that removed a person from everything, including God's presence. So there was no need to talk about God because the person was done. Many of the things that occur between last Sunday's stories and this Sunday's lament reveal things about Saul that make it clear he was an extremely poor leader. You take his jealousy and his suspicion of David. He makes attempts to get rid of David. He does really dumb things in battle. There's just a lot that makes it clear that this is not going to be the king who leads Israel to success. And given that Saul was trying to kill David, you might expect David to at least be relieved that Saul is dead. Maybe a little exulting going on. But no, that's not what we have. We have a personal and a poignant statement of grief that experts are pretty sure David actually did right. And it's a statement of grief over Saul's death as well as Jonathan's. He speaks of what their deaths mean for Israel as well as for what the loss means to him personally. David reminds Israel and us that Saul's kingship, as flawed as it was important. David remembers and reminds us that Saul was God's anointed. Saul fought and initially beat back the Philistines. He led Israel to a restored sense of identity and a small window of freedom. His initial success kept alive the hope that Israel's story as God's people would not end. Jonathan's courage and leadership were well known and widely admired. And now Saul is gone and Jonathan is gone, and Israel has been defeated by the Philistines. Things have changed so dramatically that the future is not at all clear. Would the Israelites even have a future? This lament is a deeply human moment. It is not a political statement. Politics and theology are set aside as the people, through David, acknowledge the depth of their grief and their loss. In a loss of this size, what is really important becomes very clear. And what is absolutely fundamental is easily separated from that which is secondary. I remember when my mother died very suddenly. We were driving to her funeral, and I noticed there were cars pulling into the shopping center. over on the other side of the road. And I remember turning to Stina and saying, why are people going shopping? Don't they know my mother's dead? Why are they worrying about groceries? What's the big deal? I was very clear about what was important and what was secondary. I think we have had moments in our history as a country that are similar to the kind of thing David is lamenting. I was in 7th grade when John Kennedy was killed. As a 7th grader, I was not real adept at understanding the bigger implications of what had happened. And my primary memory is that everything stopped. There wasn't even TV, which as a 7th grader was a big deal. That's why I knew it was important, because there was no TV. I couldn't get the whole thing, but I knew something really important had happened. And I can clearly recall images of the procession down the road and of the empty horse with the boots turned backwards and the really dramatic kinds of things that happened during that time. I was in high school by the time Martin Luther King was killed. I had a better sense of what had happened, and I was very clear about the anger and the rage that erupted because I lived very close to Washington, D.C., and we lost my father for 3 days downtown. By the time Robert Kennedy was killed, I was beginning to wonder if this was like something we were going to have to learn to look for over and over and over again, because it just seemed that it just kept happening. And these were good people doing good things, and why was this going on? And of course, more recently, I think about September the 11th. I was newly appointed like a month earlier as the priest in charge of Christ Church Alameda. And even being new and wondering if I really knew what I was doing, that morning I knew that we had to do something as the church. The church had to do something in response. Happily, all the other clergy in town knew that too. And we were on the phone all morning. And we set up a meeting every night that week at 7 o'clock for the community to gather. And we got it onto the radio, and we got it into the press, and blah, blah. And Christ Church Alameda held the first meeting because we figured the attendance would be the largest the first night, and we had the bigger church on the island. We filled it. And there was the Methodist pastor, the Lutheran pastor, the Presbyterian pastor, the Episcopal priest, and the rabbi for the synagogue in town. And we all stood up front, unified. We all took turns leading prayers. We arranged for the kids to meet in another room with people who were good at kids' stuff and talk to the kids about what was going on and what they had seen and what they hadn't seen. We met with parents and talked about how to help their kids during the rest of the week. They might want to turn off the TV, stuff like that. But in the larger gathering, we gave people a chance to vent, to rage, to cry, to ask questions. And we, as a collective body up front, simply kept reminding people that God was bigger than all of this. Whatever our religious beliefs and doctrines were, we all agreed that God was bigger than all of this, and that that's where we needed to stay, even in the midst of our confusion and our fear and our disbelief. Now, given all of that, and the fact that we kept doing that all week, I'm still not convinced that we officially, as a country, lamented in the way that David did what happened on September the 11th. I'm not sure we named the depth of our loss and our fear and our concern. And I wonder sometimes if that's why people are still angry, still looking for revenge, and still making ridiculous statements about people who happen to be Arab, and assuming things about them that are probably not even true. I wonder if we are still struggling with that vulnerability that we discovered that day, that we may not have been wanting to admit until then, that we're as vulnerable as anybody else in the world. Now, when David wrote and recorded his lament, he named for himself and for the people of God the depth of their loss and the enormity of what had happened. And by naming that loss and describing its enormous impact, David freed himself and the people to be open to something new from God. He made it clear through his lament that what they had been assuming about Saul being their king and Saul's children being the king was now no longer an option. And because they were free of that belief, they were now more open to the ability to look for God's new action with them, for God's act of redemption in all of this. And as I thought about that, I realized that what I want to do is I want to write a lament for the way this country seems to be operating today. Just when polarization can't seem to get any worse, there are new depths of antagonistic behavior, and they show up over and over and over. Congress members seem so intent on winning an argument that they appear to have completely forgotten about the well-being of their own constituents, much less the well-being of the country as a whole. No one seems open to genuine conversation anymore. People just make demands. Groups that I originally was supporting because they were established to help make grassroots movements more effective in impacting various situations seem to have succumbed to the shrill tone of voice that I hear in Congress. They are just as confrontational now as the people they were originally trying to work with. Groups that originally said, let's ask for this, let's ask for that, now send me an email and say, you must demand this, you must demand that. Well, that's why I joined the group, to not use that kind of language, to not have that kind of attitude. And I'm having trouble finding groups now that don't do that. Everybody seems to be stuck in this place. And there are days when it is not at all clear to me that any good can come out of our current situation. It seems to be getting worse and worse and more divisive. But I have to remember that Israel's story didn't end with their defeat by the Philistines. I have to remember the gospel stories like the one we heard this morning, where Jesus chooses to heal those whom his society considered to be of very little value. I remember that I have just come back from a conference called Wild Goose. Wild goose is a Celtic symbol for the Holy Spirit. And this weekend I heard about a group of evangelical organizations who stood together publicly demanding some kind of reform for the immigration process. And this collection of people, these organizations, span the spectrum from extremely conservative to extremely liberal. We're talking sojourners on one end and focus on the family at the other end. And they all stood up together and said, we have to do something about immigration. And 3 days later, there was an announcement from the White House by executive order that students who came here under no choice of their own, who have finished high school and are in college or in the military, would be dropped very, very low on the deportation list. In fact, their deportation would be deferred for 2 years. It's not forgiveness, it's not a path to citizenship, but it is progress. And it's a direct response to that declaration by those groups. People who were at this conference were standing up in making that announcement and were invited to the White House to have a conversation. It's really exciting to hear that actually we can still make an impact once in a while. I'm encouraged by that. That gives me hope that something can happen. So I choose to remember, that in naming the enormity of our loss, we free ourselves to be ready for the next new thing from God. I remember that I have never yet been able to guess what God's going to do, how God will break into things to make a change. I have seen moments of God breaking in. I have generally, eventually recognized them as God breaking in, but I have never, ever known what to expect beforehand. I have to choose to trust it's going to happen again. And finally, I have to remember that when I'm in the middle of a period of loss and confusion and upheaval, everything seems to have gone mad. I think that fits today. Nothing seems to make sense. I didn't know why those people were pulling in to buy groceries in Myrtle Beach. And I remember that what is most important, we learned from Jesus. And here it is. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, and with all your soul. And you shall love your neighbor as yourself. This is the ground on which I choose to stand. This is the ground from which I will offer my prayers for this country as it struggles with its history and its values and its future. And this is the ground from which I will watch for God's next new thing.